Hey there YouTube, I'm Ikitsu, this is the Ikitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Age of Wonders Planetfall. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about another unit faction combination here, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about playing as the Promethean Vanguard. Now, this is a sort of very direct, blunt sort of composition here. I think that Promethean is not necessarily as strong for the Vanguard as the game tries to get you to believe. I think that they've sort of advertised it as a good mix for these guys. That's certainly sort of true, but I actually think Synthesis is probably a little bit stronger in the end there. You won't see, for example, me using one of my top tier stacks versus two enemy stacks by itself, simply because that's not really the kind of faction that I think this is. I think that they are capable of just being very, very dominant if they're able to get even numbers, but I think that they sort of suffer really badly if they're badly outnumbered, whereas a faction like Synthesis can make do when they're outnumbered really effectively. So anyway, let's jump a little bit into what makes these guys a little bit special there and talk about a few of the units that we think are going to be pretty good here. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about Doctrines again. In this particular case, again, we're looking at things like Colony Militia, Frontier Survival, Hearts and Minds as being very, very effective for this particular strategy. Vanguard Doctrines are really, really strong, especially at sort of pushing you into the game in a sort of effective sort of way there. Beyond that, you're going to be looking at something like Phoenix Armament Protocols there. Makes your units cheaper to build, and their upkeep cost is reduced. Now, unfortunately, this only applies to your Promethean units, and this is a bit of a problem because when you're playing as the Vanguard, I don't think that the Promethean units make the core of your army. They make sort of good support units, or even sort of a majority, but you are going to have to build a bunch of non-Promethean units, especially in the early game, because the Promethean units are not that strong in the early game. Phoenix Colonization Protocols you're not really going to need there. Phoenix Defense Protocols you're not really going to need. There's not a ton in there as far as Promethean Doctrines goes that you're really, really looking forward to. So in this sort of case, you can kind of skirt by just by relying heavily on your sort of base stuff. Even the Extermination Protocols that I've activated here, not very strong. So you're going to rely heavily on the Vanguard ones, especially for the early game, developing your colonies, making them stronger. Frontier Survival is going to be absolutely essential to getting you into the late game in a strong place there. For strategics, again, you're looking at a couple okay ones there, but for the most part, for example, the Incineration Strike, this is really quite good and it synergizes pretty nicely, but I don't think it's actually necessarily stronger than, for example, the Orbital Laser Cannon. If you're going to be attacking a colony or something like that, this one is really, really strong there. Supply drop I think is also a little bit stronger, stuff like that. I generally tend not to use these strategic ones anyhow though. On the tactical layer you're looking at a couple okay ones here, but I think that the biggest one that you're going to be using is just the Firestorm projectile. As far as this faction goes, the Pyrex bomb, like, people are just going to move out of it, I find. I don't think that it's actually that easy to use. It does stop things from using their long-range artillery abilities, because if they are not moving out of there, it does deal tremendous amounts of damage, but it's a very expensive one to just force enemy units to move, whereas other things could be dropped down to like outright disable units. So those are sort of your doctrines there. I think that because you've got fairly decent doctrines, both tactical, strategic, and whatever these are called here, the operations, tactical, strategic, and doctrine are all really quite good on the Vanguard side of things. You're going to rely on those more than you are on the Promethean ones. So in this particular case, the decent Vanguard ones can sort of lead you through without having to worry as much. Now, you're not getting the massively powerful sort of things that we saw in terms of production and energy construction that we saw with Synthesis, and this means that your armies are going to be a little bit weaker than you would see with Synthesis. In that particular case, when you're not able to produce as many units, now you're going to notice that we did actually have a lot of production here. The reason that we're capable of producing so many units is not going to be reliable. If you have access to the AI Factory Overseers from the Autonoms, absolutely use that. That's going to let you catch up and keep up with something like Synthesis in terms of unit production. If you don't have access to this, they're going to be churning way ahead of you, because +2 production per worker, like even with this, the Synthesis is capable of also doing that energy per turn. so they're able to just get way more of that. So under normal circumstances, though, you're capable of producing units that are fairly elite, because the choke point is no longer just having not enough cosmite to produce from like 5 cities that are all capable of producing units really quickly. Instead, you're limited more by your energy reserves and your production capacity. In particular, like our production capacity was not capable of keeping up with my energy or cosmite in this particular game, so that was just slightly unbalanced in terms of how I distributed my cities. But generally speaking, I think that you're a little bit econ weak with Prometheans. Vanguard's relatively decent economy upgrades and stuff like that, doctrines and operations, are going to keep you in the game, but they're not as strong as you could potentially have from other things there. Looking at our units, we've got access to, first of all, the Uyghur Tank here. Now, this is not a great early game vehicle necessarily, just because it's fairly expensive, but it's not super hard to get access to. Unlike with the laser tank, this does not require the heavy elite weapons facilities to build, so you can get them relatively early. It only requires, I believe, the specialist center. It's a fairly decent unit for what it is there. The force projector and the wide force blast are kind of okay. But what really marks this vehicle as special is the defense mode Fallout Boost shields and the Fallout Protection shielding. This makes this unit unique in that it is a very durable, but still potentially punchy defensive unit. So the Fallout Protection shielding here by default gives you a surrounding radius of +2 shield, +3 thermal resistance, and immunity to thermal status and hazard effects. You can actually move your units and your tank in a sort of a squirming inchy way if you want to micro it all the way across to get across large amounts of thermal just with your tank and anyone under the sort of bubble. It's kind of interesting that you can do that, but yeah, this makes it so that this unit is very good at defending units that are nearby it, but more so, if you just move it into a cluster of units and go defensive mode, you gain an additional 3 shields and an additional 4 thermal resistance, which makes this unit really good at defending a bunch of squishier units near it. 5 shields and 7 thermal resistance, I think. Yeah, 7 thermal resistance is a huge amount of extra defense. If you're up against something like lasers, this is going to make your units ridiculously hard to damage and kill. So this thing is mostly just here to be support. Now, I would not rely on just one with everything clustered around it, because what's going to happen is your opponent is going to just stagger all of your units into utter oblivion. Even if they're not capable of dealing a ton of damage, if they have enough attacks that can stagger, your entire stack is going to get staggered for multiple turns in a row, and you're never going to be able to counterattack. So if you're using this sort of strategy like I am, take 2 of these per stack, or at least take, 1 and then have some of your units not actually within the bubble. Other than that, though, the Force Projector and the Wide Force Blast are mostly good for cleaning up enemies once you're no longer worried about protecting your units as much there. They're pretty okay attacks there, Wide Force Blast in particular being pretty okay. And this unit's just pretty resilient all on its own there. One of the things that you're going to want to look at for this thing, you could potentially get something like the reactive armor plating, but realistically speaking, because of the shield system, you're not going to be taking a ton of damage with this anyway. You're not really going to have access to the self-repair systems under normal circumstances, so you may have to go with the Pyrex absorption panels, but those are pretty hard to use. The other thing that you're going to really want to note is that you've got the hazmat protection that you can put on this thing. This gives you 4 bioresistance and hazard immunity, which you don't really care about, but the thing about this thing is that if you've got the hazmat protection on this, you basically don't take damage from the Amazons anymore, because their main damage channels are thermal and bio. So throwing this onto a bunch of your units really forces them to take other techs that let them change their arrow types into different damage types, because otherwise they're going to be doing like 0 damage with pretty much everything. This can also help counter a lot of those armor shredding abilities that are out there, because a lot of the bio attacks are armor shredding and can shred this guy's armor down to the point where it can take some damage from it. The other thing is, if you're against a lot of melee units will ignore those 5 points of shields that they've got. You can add the backlash projectors, and this means that this unit will clear out anything that's trying to kill it in melee combat. Other things, nanite injectors from the Vanguard side of things can be chucked onto them to make them much more durable for fairly cheap, and also give them a cheap heal. That still allows them to go into defensive stance if they need to. I wouldn't use these guys for their offense. I wouldn't bother even putting the cheap thermal targeting ray on it, just because you don't really need it with this particular vehicle. It really is going to be using its defense mode, and this is one of those rare things in this game where standing around in defense mode is going to be one of the more optimal solutions with this thing. Next up, we've got the Phoenix Walker. This thing I don't really bother using under normal circumstances. What you would use this guy for is in situations where you're expecting to fight a lot of melee creatures, in which case this thing can be pretty powerful, because like there is a sort of semi-weakness that Promethean has against strong melee compositions. And this can sort of make that negated, because if you've got one of these standing up there tanking up your front line, not a lot's going to be able to get past it. A lot of melee things are going to get melted by the backlash projectors, and you could also give this guy something like the thermal targeting array if you really wanted to. It does benefit a lot from a lot of the Vanguard mods. Something like interlocking armor for a fairly cheap one if you're trying to go cheap, although this unit's so expensive you're probably going to want more expensive stuff there. And it's also one of those rare ones where you could potentially get a lot of benefits out of the sequential kill system. You go with the plasma cutter, beam someone down with it and murder them that sort of way there, and then you can activate Firestorm or Torrent of Flame with that extra action gained by the sequential kill system. Not that I would really necessarily recommend that build there. I think that this one's better off with a defensive type build there. Potentially the reactive armor plating, unlike the other guy, this guy is going to be taking quite a lot of damage. This also adds to his armor a nice amount there. So you could go something like reactive armor plating, backlash projectors, and maybe even nanite injectors or the sequential kill system if you really need those, or superheated plasma actuators, depends on sort of what you're planning on doing. Any of those sort of combinations will allow this guy to get swarmed, surrounded by a whole bunch of enemy melee combat troops, and like the funny thing is, if you get completely surrounded by enemy troops there, you just pop Firestorm, and it's going to deal a bunch of damage from Firestorm to all the adjacent units there, and as soon as that applies, they're all going to get to make an attack of opportunity against this guy, an Overwatch attack, and they're all going to take a bunch of damage from the backlash projectors. So if he's surrounded by 6 units, the backlash projectors might go off 6 times, assuming that you live throughout the whole thing. And if they've got the reactive armor plating, then they're going to also be taking 50% of the damage that they deal to this guy. So they could kill themselves. Like, you could kill an entire stack that's in melee against this thing just by having this thing standing there. So it's kind of nuts in that sort of sense there. I do still think that this is a fairly weak unit, though, for its particular cost there. You're generally not hoping to stay in melee combat with this composition. It's just there to defend you against other melee compositions that are trying to sort of swarm over your squishier backline. For Vanguard Trooper, this is still going to be your meat and potatoes kind of unit in a broad sense. They're very good at their job of just dishing out some good damage at a cost-effective sort of rate there. Again, they do sort of scale off in the late game unless you've got some upgrades on them, but like I said, with the Vanguard Promethean faction combination, you're looking at a situation where you're not super starved for Cosmite, so I would rather use Cosmite liberally while still being a bit efficient in terms of my production. So that means that you can get a really powerful late game trooper here, like this version here. This is a powerful sort of late game unit that only has one late game tech added to it, the ammunition fireburst. This is going to turn your guys into an artillery spitting unit that just murders everything that gets sort of near it there. Very powerful sort of unit to use this with. The thermal targeting array and the range extender, both of these are tier 1 mods in terms of like the cost there, so both of them only cost 5 Cosmite. So even in the early game, you can do a setup like this, where you've got the rail accelerators, the thermal targeting array, and the nanite injectors, making a good, durable, solid frontline unit that's capable of mowing down a lot of enemies pretty effectively. The big problem with this is that you are going to have to find some way to set up the thermal targeting array by lighting the enemy on fire with other units there. And same sort of thing with the Vanguard Engineer there. You can get the same kinds of mods on them for fairly cost effectively, and that will apply to their turrets as well. Again, you're looking for ways to apply burning to the enemy before you get access to the shells there. One way that you could do it is through laser units here. Personally, I don't recommend it, but you could do it. The Vanguard Assault Bike does have the ability to use the wide field laser array with something like the incinerator module attached to it. So if you use this and the wide field laser array, you could light a bunch of enemy units on fire and then follow that up with your other units there. Personally, I don't think that that's super reliable. What I've been doing personally is keeping stacks located with my heroes, and since your starting hero has access to... where the hell is my starting hero? Alright, my starting hero is over here. We always start off with a hero that has access to learned There we go, Plasma Surge. This is a way to get a lot of burning down on enemies with this thing here. You do require level 4 before you can actually get this, but you can do this even if you're not in a tank or anything like that. You just have your general surge into the middle of the enemy there, dealing incendiary to a bunch of units around it. So then you can use that setup to then fire down at the enemy with your thermal mods there. It works pretty effectively, I've been finding. You also start off with you can also get thermal grenades pretty easily with this faction here. There's a general that specifically has that. Once you get him, you can also use his thermal grenade, have that be effective. Where the hell did he go? I think that's this guy. Yeah, so this also is something that you'll eventually pick up there, usually pretty quickly actually. That can help do a bit of setup there, but generally speaking, you're only going to be using this part of the strategy for the early game. Pretty quickly you're going to be switching out to using your specialist unit, the Vanguard Purifier. Now the Vanguard Purifier looks like it's supposed to be a replacement for your basic infantry, but I kind of don't think that they work super well for that. They're a little bit more expensive than most secret technology based units there in terms of production cost. They cost 270 compared to most costing 250, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it does add up, and especially it's harder in the early game to get these guys produced. So producing like a stack of 5 of these guys plus a hero doesn't really feel very cost effective to me, especially because their basic attack isn't really that strong compared to a lot of the other ones. Like the Hacker, I think, is a lot better at sort of being a cost effective damage dealer. Now, the reason that the Vanguard one feels like it's a replacement for the main troop type in particular is that they have the Plasma Repeater instead of the other one used by other factions there. And I think we can actually find the other version used by other people here. So the Syndicate. So this is an example of like the Syndicate Purifier. It's only got 5 range instead of 7, and it's got a single action gun instead of repeating. This means you can go in and deal a lot more damage if you've been forced to move in particular, and that extra burst of damage may make this a better assault troop type thing. You can launch that plasma bomb on the previous turn to deal a bunch of extra area of effect damage from that longer range, but as soon as you've done that, you can get in close and use the plasma blast for a decent amount of damage. That's not what the Vanguard version does. The Vanguard version is best at that 7 range, blasting away with the repeating laser or plasma repeater for large amounts of damage there. And they're better at applying incendiary than the other ones. So these guys do compete with the Vanguard Soldier pretty closely, but I think the Vanguard Soldier is just much more cost effective, costing almost half as much in terms of production while still being pretty comparable. These guys only have 10 damage instead of like 11 or something like that, and the launch plasma bomb unfortunately takes their full round action, so you're either going to be launching the plasma bomb or you're going to be firing the plasma repeater. Now, what I actually like to use these guys for is not as a mainline infantry unit that sort of does the damage. What I like using these guys for is their launch plasma bomb ability as a support unit. You can use launch plasma bombs to get a whole bunch of enemies on fire, get a whole bunch of the ground on fire, and that way you can use your thermal targeting arrays with other units really efficiently. The way I've ended up upgrading these guys is a bit weird, but it's this one over here. Ours have access to the Phoenix Bomb launchers, which gives them a long-range artillery strike with a thermal thing that can light people on fire. And then we've also got the miniaturized missile array, which is also capable of dealing a bunch of stagger to enemy units there, and also lights the ground on fire. And yeah, it's just a generally effective way of throwing out extra artillery. This unit never has to use its basic plasma repeater, like ever. It can cycle through these over and over again. So you start off like launching the miniaturized missile array at the enemy, and then it staggers them so they have a harder time advancing towards you. Then you launch the Phoenix Bomb launchers on them, and they're lit on fire and everything like that. And at that point in time, your units should be in range, so that they all open up fire on them, and they advance through all that fire and stuff like that. And at that point in time, when they get close, or are in melee combat, or whichever they happen to decide to do, you launch the plasma bomb on them to make sure that they're still standing in a sea of fire. At which point, by the time you've done all that, the brimstone missile's off cooldown again. So this allows these guys to just lay out humongous amounts of area of effect fire that they can deliver from the backline, and your other units can then capitalize on it. You are going to want like 2 of these guys in a stack there, generally speaking, but they're pretty damn good on their own. If you don't have the ability to get a unit like that in your stack there, or even just because it's a really strong unit there, you can go ahead and get something like this, the Vanguard Soldier here with the rail accelerators, the thermal targeting relay, and the fireburst ammunition. This unit absolutely demolishes things. It's absolutely ridiculous how much damage this can lay out there. Not only is it capable of dealing a good amount of damage per shot here, this is an area effect shot. The reason that I like these guys actually more than the fully upgraded versions of these guys, assuming, like, let's say I wanted to make these guys damage dealers, I would give them the superheated plasma actuators for that extra damage there, the thermal targeting array for obvious reasons there, and then we would probably layer something on them like, say, honestly, there's not as many good things. I think we'd have to go with something like the sequential kill system, honestly. This is more damage, but it's not an area of effect attack. It does mean that the plasma bomb, though, is really, really powerful, but yeah, ultimately we're looking at a unit that doesn't really have as much potential to deal damage in an area, because one plasma bomb at 24 damage and immolation, which is really, really powerful, isn't as strong as basically being able to deal a ton of extra damage through the area of effect burst effect that the troopers have. Now, for single target damage, yes, the Vanguard Purifier will be stronger, but at a much, much higher cost, because they, again, start off with a much higher sort of production cost. If we take a look at what this ends up looking like here, again, thermal targeting array and super plasma actuators, blah, blah, blah. Okay, 306 production and 44 cosmite, which is, you know, okay, but we've got 180 production here and 25 cosmite, and this just is something that's much, much easier to produce. 180 production for a unit is practically nothing. 25 cosmite is pretty expensive, but that's affordable. We'll be able to build a lot of those, whereas a bunch of these guys would be really, really difficult. Now, you'll notice that a lot of my units have very offense-orientated modules on them. Only a few units are built around having their own defenses, especially the early game troopers. That's because of the Uyghur Tank. Like I was talking about earlier, this thing's capable of boosting out shields for a lot of your units to an absolutely ludicrous degree. So what you can do is you can have this thing defending your units, sticking close to them, and making your units much, much more durable. Now, compositions I find for Promethean work best when you're working in unit combinations, working in tandem. The Promethean purifiers light enemies on fire. Your other troops take advantage of, whether it's engineers or the Vanguard trooper. The Uyghur Tank keeps your units defended. So if we take a look over at this stack over here, we have got these guys sort of working on their own, but they are being defended by our general here, who is in an Uyghur Tank. The tank is being designed to absorb damage pretty well here. We've got, I should also add another thing here, but basically speaking, this thing is designed mostly to soak up damage from the enemy, and it can do that pretty effectively there. It's designed to keep these other guys down here safe from enemy fire there. The Pug and the Assault Bike here, they're just things that were in the starting stack from the beginning there, and they just never died, so we kept them in there. Other than that, though, we've also got access to these stacks up here. Now, these stacks did just get absolutely demolished in a bunch of defensive battles I had to fight. Recently, this one actually just got through like a 2v1, or it could even, or sorry, a 3v2, where they were defending the city against a much, much more effective, much bigger stack against them, but they were still able to hold out pretty effectively. And they even lost some in a big defense against another 3-stack at Dusadar, so this was their second major defense without me being able to reinforce them all that effectively. Down here, we've also got some just random ass units here. This one's being set up here. You can see actually we've got some more tanks that are rolling in. They're going to start joining these units here. I think the ideal for me personally is the engineers. The tank and the Devastator split into a team of its own, so those 3 units together. The reason that I wouldn't want to just have one Uyghur Tank surrounded by 5 units is that if that starts getting bombarded by AoEs, that could be some real problems there. Now, there are some weaknesses, I think, to the Promethean sort of way of playing. I think that air units give them a bit of a harder time because they're not capable of dealing as much splash damage as effectively against air units. It's harder to force them to cluster together. There's no choke points in the air sort of thing. It's also a little bit harder to deal environmental damage to air units since they're capable of flying over all of your fire that you leave on the ground there. That said, a lot of air units are fairly squishy and fragile, so the high offense capabilities of these units can work quite well in your favor. And the defenses from the Uyghur Tank works well since most air units are entirely range-based. So that is, generally speaking, the majority of the things that you're going to be seeing with the Promethean Vanguard combo. I think that Promethean's fairly straightforward, and you're going to see combinations like this for a lot of the other factions there. But there are going to be a lot of situations where your core unit just isn't as good as the Promethean core unit, and in that case, it's going to change up the dynamic quite a lot. For us, the Vanguard engineers and soldiers are just really, really good troops. They're going to be reliable, they're going to be able to deal a lot of damage, and because of the Uyghur Tank, they're going to be well protected. So in that sort of case there, we definitely focus more on keeping those guys around, whereas we might, for example, with the Promethean, what are they called? Amazons, we might switch to a more heavily focused Promethean version where we use the Amazon purifiers as our core troop there. But anyhow, that is, generally speaking, our look at the Promethean Vanguard. Remember, you're going to want to focus heavily on units that are fairly heavily upgraded. Your stacks are going to have to be pretty built around units that are heavily upgraded because you're probably not going to have as many just free moments to produce crap with. When I was playing as the Synthesis, there were tons of turns where I had like 3 cities that could produce something really, really quickly, and we didn't have enough Cosmite for it. That's not really happening here with this particular faction. There's tons of turns where all I can do is produce 1 unit, and I might as well produce a single unit that takes up all of my Cosmite for that turn, which means heavily, heavily upgraded powerful units. So anyway, that's our look at the Promethean Vanguard combination. I hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you guys all next time.